Vannetta Chapman has published over 100 articles in Christian, family magazines and received over 24 awards from Romance Writers of America chapter groups. She discovered her love for the Amish while researching her grandfather's birthplace of Albion, Pennsylvania. Her first novel, A Simple Amish Christmas, quickly became a bestseller. Chapman lives in Texas Hill Country with her husband. An Amish Baby for Christmas by Vannetta Chapman. Thomas felt his breath catch in his throat. Abigail had turned her face up to his. A smile danced across her expression, and she had a healthy glow, a maternal glow. He swallowed the lump and stepped back, bumping into the buggy. Something wrong? You looked like you'd had a fright. No, nothing to be afraid of. I was just, looking at the window displays, nice fall stuff. Abigail laughed. Didn't guess you to be a window display kind of guy. Her laughter felt good, so much better than the look of despair on her face that Thomas had seen when he first arrived that morning. The day wasn't going at all like he'd planned. Not that he was getting involved, because spending too much time with Abigail would not be prudent. Hopefully within a few months the estate would be settled. She could hire permanent workers, and Thomas would be on his merry way. Except suddenly, it didn't sound as appealing as it usually did. Chapter 1. Thomas Albrecht was walking out of the grocery store, juggling 3 full-to-the-brim grocery bags when he practically ran into his bishop. Ezekiel Hochstedler had recently turned 80. Thomas had been there to help celebrate the day, along with their entire community. Ezekiel's only concession to his age was a cane, which he now used to help with a knee that had been giving him trouble. Thomas understood that the man in front of him was having a hard time learning to step back. He'd only recently delegated a few of his church duties to his deacons because his wife had insisted. Ezekiel continued to preach and counsel and generally oversee his flock. Most of the women that Thomas had worked for in the past had been widows. Their living situations were usually stuck in some phase of transitioning. Most were post-funeral, but hadn't yet sold the family place to move in with one of their children. Thomas liked to think that he was able to help make that transition less traumatic, less difficult. Her situation is somewhat unusual. Ezekiel didn't add anything else, and Thomas knew that questioning him would be futile. Often these situations were sensitive. Thomas would learn more about the particulars of widow Yutzy as it became necessary. Ezekiel pulled a slip of paper from his pocket and handed it to Thomas. This is Luke Fisher's number. He's the bishop of the East Side group. He actually has a cell phone, Thomas winked. They're a bit more liberal than we are. And you think I should call? I told him you would. Instead of being offended that Ezekiel had spoken for him, Thomas laughed. Ezekiel knew him well. He wouldn't turn down helping one of the older members of their community. He stuffed the slip of paper in his pocket. I'll do it. He thought that would be the end of the conversation, but Ezekiel tapped his cane against the ground. Today, if you could, the situation is a bit dire. Before lunch, Thomas promised. He hurried home to his apartment above Lemon's Mercantile. He was perhaps the only Amish man in the district who lived in an apartment, but the arrangement worked well for him. The Lehman's house sat on the back side of the property. Beside it was a medium-sized barn that housed their buggy horse, as well as Thomas's mare, plus some goats, a dairy cow, and whatever animals the children persuaded their parents to let them keep. The Mercantile was a busy place, which didn't bother Thomas at all, since he was rarely home during the day. After he spoke with Bishop Ezekiel, Thomas hurried home to his apartment, made his way up the back stairs, and put away his groceries. Then he went down to the office in the Mercantile and asked to use the phone. Of course, Thomas. New job? Though Mary Lehman was only 45, her brown hair was liberally streaked with gray. She had taken to wearing reading glasses that hung from a braided ribbon. Now she positioned them on the end of her nose and studied him. Thomas thought if there was a sweeter woman in the town of Shipshewana, he'd certainly never met her. Maybe. Well, call then, we don't want you starving. That was a standing joke between them. Mary insisted on feeding him at every available opportunity. Just the week before, he'd accused her of attempting to fatten him up for the winter. Now he called the number on the slip of paper Ezekiel had given him. It was unusual for a bishop to have a cell phone, though plenty of Amish had one for their business. He could understand how it would help a bishop who was basically on call 24 hours a day. No doubt the man kept it in his barn rather than the house, a concession to the old ways and the sanctity of family time. He was surprised when Luke answered on the second ring. Unfortunately, the connection was a bad one, and the man's voice kept cutting in and out. He was traveling in his buggy, evidenced by the background sounds of automobiles, wind, and the clip-clop of a horse. I'm Thomas Albrecht. Bishop Ezekiel Hochstetler asked me to call you about helping a widow. Oh yeah, very good. Asher Yutzy, crops are still, she won't, if you could go by goat, help her. This connection isn't very good. What was that you said about a goat? The bishop must have reached the top of a hill, because suddenly his voice was as clear as if he were standing in the mercantile office. As he gave Thomas the address for the Yutzy place, Mary slipped a pad of paper and a pen in front of him. Then the connection dropped completely, and Thomas was left staring at the receiver. What did he say? Was that Bishop Fisher? I heard that he's using a cell phone now. Apparently, that way he's available whenever his congregation needs him. He may be available, but that doesn't mean they'll be able to understand him. Thomas handed her the phone as he frowned at the piece of paper. He asked me to help a widow Yutzy. She lives on the east side of town. Different district, then. I haven't heard of her, but that's no surprise the way this area is growing. Did you know there are 20,000 Amish in the Lagrange-Elkhart counties now? I did not. I'm lucky to keep up with the people in our own church. Where exactly does this widow Yutzy live? Thomas showed her the address. Huh, that's the east side, all right nearly halfway to Lagrange. I suppose that's where I'm headed then. Chicken and dumplings for dinner, Mary called after him. And Chloe is making peach cobbler. Thomas winced at the mention of Mary's daughter, Chloe. She'd had a rather pronounced crush on him for the last 2 months. Chloe was 15, and Thomas was 28. Soon he'd be too old to be the recipient of schoolgirl crushes. The day couldn't arrive fast enough, in his opinion. Chloe's current infatuation would pass. These situations always did, but until Chloe turned her attentions elsewhere, he was better off avoiding the Lehman's dinner table. Too bad. He would have loved to have a bite of that peach cobbler, and Mary's chicken and dumplings was one of life's blessings. He momentarily considered braving Chloe's pointed looks and long sighs, but shook off the idea. He could make himself a sandwich with the groceries he'd just purchased. Chloe was bound to move on to a boy closer to her own age soon. He'd wait her out. The Yutzy place might have been on the east side of Shipsh, but it was still a relatively short trip. Shipshewana was, after all, small. The number of people living in town remained under 800, an even mix of Amish and English. County numbers were just under 40,000, and a vast majority of those folks were Amish. In the last 10 years, the area had become something of a tourist attraction for Englishers curious about plain living. The auction house and flea market consistently attracted crowds of an additional 35,000. Still, on days the market was closed, Shipsh reacquired its small-town feel. After Thomas had traveled east for 6 miles, he stopped to ask for directions. Big place that Asher Yutzy had. Real shame about his passing. The man tending the vegetable stand was in his 60s. He nodded back toward the main road. Keep following this road until you see the county number on the left. Yutzy's place is the second on the right. You can't miss it. Asher had dreams of starting a horse farm. He put that newfangled PVC fencing around the entire 220 acres. Thomas had been inspecting the man's produce, thinking that Mary would enjoy some of the fresh green beans. He nodded toward a quart-sized tray. "I'll take those, and some of the berries, too." "Did you say 220? "I did." Asher had a different idea of plain and simple than most folks. Even with the man's warning, Thomas was surprised when he pulled onto the lane that led to the Yutzy property. Most Amish farms were 80 to 100 acres, never more than a family could manage. The idea was to provide for your household and make a modest living from the land. Amish farmers would hire help during harvest, but it was rare to hire full-time permanent workers. Growing a vast agricultural empire wasn't the point of farming. Enough land to raise a family, that was their motto. It was obvious the late Mr. Yutzy had different thoughts on the matter. Though the entrance was plain enough, the white fencing stretched as far as he could see in both directions. Thomas had priced the fencing for a farm on the north side of Shipsh. It had been exorbitantly expensive. In the end, they'd gone with metal T-posts and goat fencing because, well, the man had goats. Why would Yutzy have spent the money on PVC? And why did he have such a large spread? Perhaps the man had a house full of sons and planned to divvy it up between them. But if he had sons, then Widow Yutzy wouldn't need Thomas. Ezekiel had said it was an unusual situation. Thomas called out to his horse, Duchess, directing the chestnut mare down the lane. She was a fine horse with a beautiful gray coat and black socks. He realized it was a sin to feel pride, but he didn't figure it was a sin to appreciate God's creatures. At least that's the way he justified his satisfaction with the horse. A lovely September day, a mare that tossed her head but followed his lead. And a new job. September was progressing on a good note. He pulled up in the circular drive. It was dirt, of course. No Amish home had paved driveways that he knew of, but this one had a center garden area that had once probably looked quite impressive. Like everything else, it had been sorely neglected. The house was small in comparison to the size of the farm. He was surprised to see the fields had yet to be harvested. In addition, a glimpse of the back garden revealed a mess of weeds and vegetables that needed to be collected. Then there was the goat standing on the front porch, munching on what might have been dead flowers in a pot. Perhaps Widow Yutzy wasn't physically able to take care of the place. But if that was the situation, then their bishop would have sent help. Something else was going on here, though he couldn't imagine what. He climbed the porch steps, shooed the goat away, knocked on the door, and then stepped back. Thomas wasn't extraordinarily tall, at 5'11", but his size sometimes intimidated people who didn't know him. He was built solid as an ox. His mom had loved that phrase, though now that he thought about it, she'd also called him clumsy as an ox. The woman who answered his knock was younger, so a dochter perhaps. She opened the front door and peered through the screen at him. "My name is Thomas Albrecht. Your bishop asked me to come by. He said you might be needing some help around the place." She shook her head, still studying him, still silent. "I couldn't help but notice, as I drove in, that your alfalfa hasn't been harvested. You'll need to see that's taken care of soon. Thank but nein, I don't need your help." Her voice was soft, but brooked no argument, which left him in something of a pickle. He'd told his bishop and her bishop that he'd do his best to help. Perhaps he could reason with her. "After the harvest, I suspect you'll want to put in a cover crop, or maybe winter wheat. Then there's your vegetable garden in the back. I can take care of all that as well, and I don't need your help." Since she was standing in shadow, he couldn't make out her expression, but her tone suggested she was determined to turn him away. Your fields tell a different story. She pushed out through the screen door, and you could have knocked Thomas over with a fly swatter. The woman had dark brown hair, a good bit of it escaping from her cap. She was probably half a foot shorter than he was, and her eyes were the color of hazelnuts. Though she was slight in most ways, she was also very pregnant. Certainly, she was in her last trimester. Perhaps she was past due. He didn't see how her stomach could get any larger. Plus, she was barefoot. Who walked around barefoot in mid-September? It was warm, but it wasn't that warm. Taking 2 steps back, he averted his eyes to a spot over her left shoulder. Perhaps I could speak with Widow Yutzy. I'm Widow Yutzy. But she stared up at him, arms crossed protectively on top of her stomach. I'm Widow Yutzy, and as I've told the gut bishop before, I'm not ready to decide on what type of help I'd like, when I'd like it, or who I'd like it to be. Then how will you? I'll manage. I always manage. Her voice drifted away as her gaze focused on something past him. Thomas turned to see what she was looking at, but all he saw was what he'd noted before fields in need of harvest. A horse that was in the pasture, and a near-perfect September day begging him to get to work. Widow Yutzy stepped back into the house, allowing the screen to close between them. Thank ye for the offer. Now, if you'll excuse me, I was in the middle of something. Without another word of explanation, she firmly shut the door. Abigail stood near enough to the window that she could watch Thomas Albrecht shake his head in disbelief, walk slowly down her porch steps, and climb back into his buggy. Good riddance. Unfortunately, as soon as he stepped off the porch, that stupid goat returned. She needed to find a way to keep that beast off her porch and out of her flowers. Tears stung her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Probably just baby hormones. One hand on her stomach, she whispered, "No worries, little one, no worries." Thomas Albrecht turned his buggy around and headed back down the lane. Wonderbar. He'd been easy to scare off. One look at her stomach and he'd nearly fainted. She didn't need a strange man's help. Plus, this fellow was a big guy. She had to look up at him to meet his gaze. What was Bishop Luke thinking, sending someone like that out to her place? And who was Thomas Albrecht? She'd never seen him before. That was for certain. She would have remembered. He had to be close to 6 feet and over 200 pounds, though. From what she could tell, that weight was all muscle. She walked back into the kitchen and stared at the pile of bills on the table. She needed to take care of them. The crops in the field could wait, but she had to figure out Asher's system for paying bills, and she needed to do that today. A cup of tea. That's what she needed. A cup of tea and a few minutes off her feet. Who would guess that a person's feet could swell so much? She pulled the canister of tea bags out of the cabinet, dropped one into her favorite mug, and filled the tea kettle with water. And that was when she glanced out the window. She couldn't believe it. He was back. Thomas Albrecht was back, and that stupid goat was still there, once again munching on her dead flowers. She grabbed the broom as she exited the kitchen and headed toward the front porch. All she could think of, all she could see, was that goat. He made red dots dance in front of her eyes. Regardless how much she stomped or hollered, he came back. She'd even tried beating a spoon against a pot, but the goat had only stared at her and pulled up a chrysanthemum. No matter what she tried, the goat always won, but not today. She'd had it. She raised the broom and proceeded to take wild swings at the creature, when suddenly the broom was pulled from her hands. Thomas set the broom against the porch banister and made a noise in the goat's direction. The goat never looked back. The beast jumped off the end of the porch and sauntered away. If she wasn't so irritated with Thomas Albrecht, she'd ask him to teach her to make that noise. Instead, she turned around, plucked the broom from where he'd placed it, and wondered if she could sweep him away. Maybe I wasn't clear before. Oh, you were clear. Then why are you back? Because your fields still need harvesting. Thomas yanked off his hat, revealing brown hair that had a surprising curl to it. Just hear me out. Why should I? Because I have something I need to say, which stopped Abigail in her tracks. She understood the need to be heard. How many times had she wished Asher would just listen to her? Thomas couldn't have known that. He couldn't have guessed that he'd poked one of the sore spots in her heart. Fine, have your say, but I need to get off my feet. She collapsed into a rocking chair and stared down at her feet in despair. They didn't even look like feet. They looked like puffballs. Thomas let out a whistle. So that's why you're not wearing shoes. Couldn't get them on, not even close. Thomas started to say something and stopped. Go ahead and say it. You can't make matters worse. I was just going to ask you to stay put for a minute. I'll be right back. In 3 long strides, he was down the porch steps and headed across the yard. He made that noise to the goat again, but this time the beast followed him. Where is he going? Abigail spoke to her baby. That's what she told herself anyway. It was better than admitting that she talked to herself quite often. She closed her eyes, grateful for the cool breeze. Who would think that September could be so warm? Wasn't fall here? The leaves had turned orange and red and brown. They looked ready to abandon their perch, to fall to the ground in a cascade of color. She should open the windows in the house. Right after she made her tea. With open windows and a cup of tea, she could face the pile of bills. She must have dozed off, because the next thing she knew, Thomas was back on the porch, carrying a large bucket filled with water. Try putting your feet in there. The water from the pump was plenty cold. She wanted to argue with him, but what was the point? Instead, she slipped her feet into the water, and a sigh escaped her lips. I should have thought of that. It's a fair walk to the barn, especially if you're barefoot. Especially then. Thomas pointed to the other rocking chair. May 1st? Sure, why not? Explain to me why you don't want your fields harvested. If it's a matter of money, I'm sure your community's benevolence fund will cover the cost of my work. It's not about the money, which wasn't exactly true, but he didn't need to know the particulars of her situation. What then? Because if we don't harvest it soon, before the rains start, you're going to have an even bigger problem on your hands. Instead of meeting his eyes, Abigail picked at a spot on her apron. When was the last time she'd done laundry? What was wrong with her? Tears again stung her eyes, but she bit her lower lip, corralled her emotions, and finally looked at the stranger sitting next to her. Why do you care? Your bishop called my bishop. I live in Shipsh, more on the west side, well, northwest. Anyway, apparently Luke called Ezekiel and said you needed a hand. He hesitated and added, he said it was a bit of a special situation. What is that supposed to mean? I was hoping you could tell me. Abigail wanted to answer. The man sitting next to her was pushy, but plainly he meant well. The problem was where to start. How did she begin to explain that she was good and stuck? She seemed literally incapable of making a decision. Had 9 months with Asher completely dissolved her backbone? Or was it the baby? She honestly didn't know. Apparently growing tired of waiting, Thomas cleared his throat and barreled forward. Needless to say, when our bishops mentioned widow Yutzy, I was expecting someone older. Sorry to disappoint you. I certainly wasn't expecting someone pregnant, and yet here I am. Look. Thomas leaned forward, elbows on his knees, fingers laced together, and waited for her to turn her attention to him. She wasn't used to that, a man waiting for her attention. a man interested in her opinion. She had forgotten what that felt like. I don't know your situation, but this sort of thing is what I do. This sort of thing? I'm a property manager for plain folks. I've never heard of that. Thomas smiled and leaned back, set the chair to rocking. We sort of made up the position. Ezekiel and I, your bishop? Yeah, but he's also my friend. He's been more of a father to me than my own father. Abigail wiggled her toes in the water, then pulled her right foot out. Surprisingly, the swelling had gone down. She wanted to tell this man that she was just fine on her own, but plainly that wasn't true. She wanted to stand up and assure him that she didn't need any help, but she'd be standing barefoot, wearing a dirty apron. In the bucket of water he'd fetch it, all pointing to the fact that she did need help. All right, she conceded, but just the harvest. Those other things you mentioned cover crops and vegetables. I'm not ready to decide on those yet. It was obvious that Thomas wanted to argue with her. He opened his mouth, shut it, then stared at his work boots for a moment. Possibly he was smarter than he looked. Just the harvest then, and after that, we'll talk. Deal. Thomas studied the sky. Rain's predicted for early next week. I'd like to get this done before that happens. Hopefully, I can assemble a work crew by tomorrow. Is a work crew really necessary? Looked like a large field. How many acres are planted? Abigail shrugged. Whenever she'd asked details about the farming side of things, Asher had changed the subject. I will need a couple of extra hands at least. Don't worry about the money. I'm sure Luke will. I have plenty of money. Didn't she? Asher had never acted as if money was a problem. He dressed well, their house was adequate, and he talked on and on about his plans for the farm. Just let me know what I owe you when you're done. Thomas's right eyebrow shot up in confusion, and he swallowed the question he wanted to ask. He almost looked comical sitting there, full of energy and ideas, yet unsure how to convince her to let him attack all the chores. Apparently, he decided that fight was best left for another day. And why should he even care? He was doing a favor for his bishop or hers. That didn't make him responsible for her farm. He nodded and stood, proving he was wise enough to know not to push her. Do you need help getting inside? I'm not sick, only pregnant. Does that mean you don't need help? If she wasn't mistaken, there was a twinkle in his eyes, smart with a sense of humor. Why wasn't he married? No beard, so she knew he wasn't. Perhaps he was courting. That would explain it. A long courtship. I believe I'll sit here and enjoy this cool bucket of water a few more minutes. Thomas fetched the broom she'd left leaning against the wall of the house and handed it to her. In case that goat bothers you again. She watched him climb up into the buggy, watched the pretty chestnut Mare toss her head and trot down the lane. She watched Thomas ride off into a picture-perfect September afternoon. She wished he'd never come. She wished with all her heart that he wasn't coming back. But Abigail wanted to do this alone. She needed to do this alone. Hadn't her mom said as much in her last letter? It was in there, on the table, buried by the bills. I didn't have help at your age, and it made me stronger. This will make you stronger, Abigail Marie. Abigail didn't feel stronger. It had been 4 weeks since her husband's death. 4 weeks since she'd found herself alone in a town where she had no family or friends. And now Thomas Albrecht had appeared on a bright fall day to offer his help. Perhaps her mom would have had her out pulling in the harvest herself, but Abigail knew that wasn't going to happen. Thomas could harvest her field. She'd pay him, and then he'd be on his way. She'd be alone again. Alone in getting stronger. If her mom was correct, time would tell.